Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Rabbi Dr. Benji Levy, a founding partner of Israel Impact Partners, which works with funders to accelerate the growth of nonprofits they care about. Levy also served as CEO of Mosaic United, a historic joint venture partnership between Israel and the global Jewish community to strengthen Jewish identity and connections to Israel for youth around the world. Enjoy my conversation with Rabbi Dr. Benji Levy. Benji, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
So, first of all, let's talk about your background. You're Australian, of course. You now live in Israel and Jerusalem. But tell us, how did you get to Israel in the first place?
Look, I grew up in a very Zionist home. My parents were very passionate about Judaism and Zionism. They weren't traditionally religious, but we, had every Friday night brought the family together for Shabbat. Israel was a very important part of our lives. I went to a Jewish day school. The statistics in Australia actually are much, much higher than Israel around Jewish day school attendance. So it was much more of the norm. I feel in a sense, Australia is 2 generations behind America in terms of where the Jewish community is. And therefore we can learn a lot from that process and learn from the positives that America went in the direction and the not so positive areas. And so I was living in sort of a different time to what's seen in that kind of place. And I was always very connected in that way, great to be part of the community. And in grade 10, I started to become more connected. There was some things called the Counterpoint seminars at my school. And they had amazing madrichim from around the world, counselors from Israel, and there were Jewish identity seminars and Zionism seminars. And I basically decided to take a plunge and to come on a program to Israel, actually with B'nai Akiva youth movement, which I wasn't very involved with, for 4 months. And I found myself in a place called Kfar HaRo'eh, which is like a little town just outside Hadera in Israel, like literally the middle of nowhere from what I had understood at that time. And I was with Australians and South Africans and connecting through this kind of, new opportunity, learning Hebrew, connecting, etc. And I basically went on a journey from that moment to become, much more connected in a Jewish way.
So you brought up, this idea of Australian Jews and probably most Jews outside of the United States and Israel around the world being maybe a few steps behind the U.S. Jews. I'm curious to know, you mentioned the good things and the bad things. How would you sort of outline the positives and the negatives between what we see with U.S. Jews versus, where the rest of the world Jewry might be going based on those trends? How would you outline the 2 sides of that coin?
First of all, I don't think you can talk about Jews as a whole. I think there's a lot of different individual Jews. There's a lot of different individual communities. And I think that applies just as much in Australia and America. I would say applies even more in America because you've got more Jews. Look, there's certain key features, I think. If you're going to look at, first of all, the concept of positive and negative is subjective. So I'm sharing my opinion. It doesn't have to necessarily be taken at face value. I think a lot of the apathy we're seeing with a lot of, not all, but a lot of American Jews is a negative in my mind. I think it's a shame. I think if you want to challenge yourself, if you want to grow, if you want to connect, if you want to make an informed decision, and even if that informed decision means that you decide not to continue part of the Jewish people, I don't see a problem with that. But I think that the decision, I do see a problem with it, but I think at least it's an informed decision. And I think that apathy is really taking a lot of people away from the capacity to make an informed decision. So I see that as a huge negative. As I said, synagogue attendance, day school attendance, some of the traditional metrics, which I don't think, by the way, are necessarily the best metrics, but they're what the Jewish world uses at the moment. The Jewish Australia, by and large, from a statistic perspective, is less apathetic, is more connected, is more communal in that sense. So I think that's one of the negatives in America and positives in Australia. And I think that what Australia can do is learn from how American Jewry got to that state. and to learn from some of the mistakes and to learn from some of the positives to be able to do that. I see that as a negative. In terms of a positive, I think that there's a certain sophistication to American Jewry, which has a lot of positive elements. The top philanthropists in America give very, very, very significant money that makes a huge difference. And in Australia, there's some phenomenal philanthropists as well, but it doesn't have the same widespread giving to the same extent. A gift in Australia of $1 or $2 million is celebrated as something massive very often in certain places. And in certain places in America, that gift, the equivalent could be $50 to $100 million. And I think that's, one area. Another is the organization. And again, this is pros and cons. Sometimes I think, that some of the Jewish world suffers a bit of too much institutional Judaism and these massive institutions that perpetuate themselves in order to perpetuate themselves, not necessarily to a certain end. But again, there's certain positives. With the way the philanthropic group is set up, the way the day school system is set up, the way the synagogue system is set up, the way the Israel advocacy is set up, the way, et cetera, et cetera. Australia doesn't have that same type of centralized approach. And again, I said it's a positive and negative. I think that some of the centralized approach has negative elements, but I think the fact that it exists allows for a more productive infrastructure. And that's an area that Australia can learn from. And again, just like I said about the apathy, there's pros and cons to learn from. I believe it also about this institutionalization, the centralization, because they can learn from the positives of it and not necessarily inherit the negatives.
Interesting, very interesting. I'm curious to know your time as CEO at Mosaic United. You clearly are in the front row of working with Israel and global Jewry. That was really on the youth level, from what I understand. What did you learn as CEO of Mosaic United about the relationship between Israel and global Jewry that maybe you didn't know before you took that position?
It's a good question. I learned a lot. So yeah, it was focused on 12 to 35-year-olds. But obviously you see everything when you're in that kind of seat. I was spending once a month in a different Jewish community around the world. I hadn't had that kind of in-depth, immersive opportunity to really see all of what, global Jewry had to offer. So, I hadn't been to see what's happening in Spain or to see what's happening in England to the same extent, or South Africa. I was, I think I did nearly every single conference in American Jewry. I was at, in the first year, I went to APAC and I went to JFN and I went to JFNA and I went to the Hillel one, I went to the Olami one, I went to the Chabad one, I went to, so many different types of conferences and get-togethers. And I really got to see, I think from the inside, a lot of what that looks like. So I think that was one sense, really getting a deep dive on the one hand, on the one-on-one level, and at the same time, an incredible macro view, because I was somewhat of an outside insider. I was never completely among them, even though I was immersed in the same experiences of them. But I was always able to then step back in Israel, which is the ultimate neutral territory of the Jewish world, and in my mind, the center of the Jewish world in many different respects. So that outsider-insider perspective was phenomenal. I also didn't have preconceived notions. I was relatively young in my very early 30s, but at the same time, I wasn't seeing this when I was 10 years old or when I was 5 years old or when I was born. When you start seeing these things when you're in your early 30s, you're mature enough and you have a sophisticated enough worldview to be able to be much more critical about what you see, and also is to see it on a different extent with almost a blank slate. So that was a really incredible opportunity. And I learned a ton. I learned that there's phenomenal things out there in the Jewish world. We bash the Jewish world, I think, way too much, and we take too much for granted. And when I'm sitting there in some of these amazing opportunities, meeting with literally the leaders of the Jewish world, whether it's sitting for hours one-on-one with Rabbi Sachs and getting, that incredible opportunity, or whether it's sitting and thinking, on the philanthropic sense with the Andre Spicconis of the world, or looking at, the federations with Eric Fingerhut, or whether it's looking on the lay leadership sides with, someone like Gary Turgo, or someone like, all these different type of opportunities, the Bob Dinas of the world, the George Rohrs of the world. These people are phenomenal thinkers. They've got incredible perspectives. We are so lucky to have them. And they're just amazing leaders. And I think, we take that for granted in some senses. and a lot of our infrastructure and community we take for granted. I was able to join, one of the last things I did before Corona was I was in that march for New York against anti-Semitism. And to see, tens of thousands of Jews coming out against that. A few days before, I was, with 100,000 Jews at Siyum Hashas in Met Stadium, and seeing, so many people doing that. To see the strength of American Jewry, of global Jewry, is really, really inspiring. So I learned, a lot of the positives, and I was blown away by it. But again, I was able to see it more critically, and I alluded to some of that in the previous question you asked. But it allowed me a real macro view, and that balance being like between being on the ground and seeing these things, and actually giving sessions, and interacting with students, and interacting with parents, and interacting with people and leaders, and then being able to take that bird's eye view. I presented in the in the cabinet meetings with the key leaders of the Israeli parliament, representing and explaining what Jewry looks like outside. So you have to start bringing a lens. You have to start bringing a framework in a way that if you're just living it, you don't necessarily evaluate in the same way. So I learned a ton. It was incredible. I'm in love with our people. And like every relationship, I see room for improvement, and I want to do everything I can, but I'll never abandon it. And I can't wait to see us grow in the future.
Amazing. So there's a few things that I bookmarked in your last answer. The first one is that you mentioned that Israel is the center of Judaism, of the Jewish world. I call it the capital of the Jewish world. Semantics, of course. I'm curious to know from your vantage point, a lot of Jews, especially maybe younger generations, people that are in our age group, younger, but also older, no longer see Israel as that central point for different reasons. And I'm curious, from your lens, how can Israel get back to being the unequivocal center of the Jewish world? What does Israel need to do, and how can she do it?
So first of all, it doesn't need to get back. It objectively is. It's like, if there's a certain element of my life that I'm not necessarily acknowledging, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. If I'm, that what we have to understand the key of. So for example, let's say we're fighting with one of our parents. As much as we fight with them, they're still our parents, right? So it's about then building that relationship. And every single relationship requires time, requires effort, requires investment. Now, if you think of this in some type of, romantic, enjoyable relationship, so there needs to be spicy, fun, enjoyable things, right? So, even in a basic relationship, let's say with my kids, I have to be doing something engaging and meaningful with them. I can't just take them for granted. So I'll go and, get them something nice. I'll discuss something interesting. I'll spice things up. Yesterday, I was with my brother on the Hermon up north in Israel skiing, right? Now, obviously, me and my brother will do anything for each other, but to spend a day going and having fun together builds that relationship. The same with my wife, going on dates, going on holidays, giving each other gifts, right? Again, you don't need to do them for the relationship in the necessity sense. You do it as a luxury. But I believe that element of the luxury is actually a necessity for any successful relationship. And I think that part of what we need to do is realize that the connection and the connection between the Jewish people, or each individual Jew in Israel, has to be reframed as a relationship. It can't be seen as a country and a person. Even though it is a country and a person, it needs to be seen as a relationship. And therefore we need those exciting, inviting, inclusive, emotional kind of components on one side. And that, you could say, is Jewish pride. That's, and that's about connecting where people are at. So if I'm, someone that's in the startup world, I want to expose them to that element in Israel. If I'm someone that's into culinary experiences, I want to show them that experience in Israel. This is never enough, right? I can't just go skiing with my brother every day. I can't just go and get gifts for my wife every day. It's not plausible, but there needs to be these inputs and these inroads that expose them to that exciting, incredible element of it. And then there needs to be greater depth, because you can't have a relationship based on those experiences alone. And I think in that sense, it's about creating some type of literacy, some type of familiarity, really allowing people to migrate from being, essentially tourists to being natives, from being, seeing it from the outside to realizing it's part of who they are. I think, Josh, when you and I have spoken in the past, that was a fundamental shift for you. You came on a birthright, but then you realize this is who you are. So you get that excitement at original, but now you're one of us, so to speak. I'm also one of us. 3.5 years I made Aliyah myself, and it shifts that perspective. You don't need to make Aliyah to have that perspective shift. I had that perspective shift, that paradigm shift, way before I made Aliyah. And I started to look at it in a different light. And part of that is to create that literacy. It's about understanding the language. It's about understanding the foundational texts that connect us to this land and connect us to this people, the moral compass that makes us who we are. It's about caring about, the fabric of society here and realizing that France is critically important. Russia is critically important. Argentina is critically important. But Israel, Zeh Shelanu. This is ours. Ein li eretz acheret. I don't have another land. It's a relationship. The famous story of Chaim Weizmann when he was trying to sell the idea of Israel in Europe. And someone said, we've offered you the Kimberleys in Australia. We've offered you Uganda. Why is it that you're obsessed with this little piece of land that's so contested with all these different kinds of things around? Why don't you just come so much closer, so much easier? And he said, it's like me saying to you, why do you go so far, travel so far to go visit your grandmother when there's so many other old women in the street next to you? There's a difference. It's family. There's a powerful, palatable relationship that needs to be built. And therefore, we need to take people first on the journey of engagement in an exciting, meaningful way, and then help them go from engagement to education. So they build a fundamental and foundational relationship that wherever they are in the world, Israel stays the center of their life in a meaningful way that informs who they are and that really colors the life that they're living.
Amazing. I also want to go back to what you said about Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. I know you had a personal relationship with him. He, in my opinion, is, if not the #1 Jewish leader of the last 100 or so years, definitely in the top 5. What are some of the things that you learned from him that you still take with you to this day?
So there's a lot. I think one of the most fundamental things was his capacity, and still continues through his teachings and his books, to really articulate Judaism in a packageable, palatable way. We alluded to this in the previous question. He was someone that lived this. I had the honor of taking him around Australia, seeing him one-on-one with students, seeing him speak to thousands of people, spending time together, reading and he had this amazing ability to understand how to take these broad, powerful ideas that to some people seem timely of a different time, and to show that they're truly timeless. To be able to take these powerful, things that have sustained our people and to show people how relevant they are in the here and in the now. And I think that was possibly one of his most fundamental contributions. There wasn't a contradiction between, the world and Judaism. His world was engaged with Judaism and his Judaism was engaged with the world. And he lived that and he taught that. And he wasn't just a textbook, as he said about other people, but he was a text person, expressing that in the very fabric of his being. And I think that's what the world needs to see. I think that there's this false dichotomy that we're seeing between the world and Judaism, between the secular and the sacred. And we've had many thinkers that have done incredible work. Rabbi Hirsch did incredible work in this neo-orthodoxy. Rabbi Cook did incredible work in showing the holistic relationship between them. Rabbi Soloveitchik did incredible work in bringing together those concepts. But I think Rabbi Sacks in this day and age was able, on the back of those thinkers, actually one of his first books, Tradition in Untraditional Age, he wrote in the early 90s. Actually, he analyzes each of those thinkers I just mentioned. He also analyzes the Khatam Sofer, Rabbi Moses Sofer, who was really one of the forebearers of Haredi Judaism that rejected it completely. And he was able to sort of go through this incredible sweep of Jewish history, this incredible sweep of Judaism, of Jewish philosophy, of Jewish law, and this incredible sweep of secular philosophy, and a whole array of different topics from politics to psychology to education to law, and really be able to start synchronizing and seeing the relationships between them and seeing how they can work together. He wrote in an incredible book called The Great Partnership, where he shows how science and Judaism are so complementary. But he does it from an authentic scientific perspective and an authentic Jewish perspective. He doesn't impose science on Judaism from without, and he doesn't impose Judaism on science from without. He looks at the beautiful harmony between the two. And I think, that's one of the greatest things I learned from him. And, it's something that I try to live in my own life, and I try to live up to. Obviously, I'm nowhere near there, and I'm not sure we're going to have the privilege of seeing another Rabbi Sacks soon. But thank God he left us 36 books, hundreds of hours of teachings, thousands of hours of teachings. And thank God he inspired many others to continue the legacy that he started.
Speaking of books, you've written 2 books. Tell us a little bit more about each book and what inspired you to write them.
So the first book I wrote is called An Oasis in Time, 7 Thoughts for the Seventh Day. And it's about Shabbat. And essentially, there was this idea of the Shabbat project founded by the Chief Rabbi of South Africa. And I was in charge of it in Australia, and I sort of brought it to Australia. And we did the most incredible, different elements. And I think this actually relates to what we discussed about the pride versus the literacy. So I started off with the pride. We had an incredible Shabbat service on Bondi Beach with thousands of people. We had an incredible challah bake with thousands of people. We had an incredible Havdalah concert with thousands of people. And that really brought so many people into it. And then a lot of people were saying, but what about the depth of Shabbat? And when I'm standing, in front of thousands of people at a challah bake, I can speak for 10 minutes, but I can't give the same depth. So the book on Shabbat was sort of my attempt to be, what Abraham Heschel did in his time on the Sabbath, and other thinkers, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan and different people that have written on Shabbat, Senator Lieberman, to try and bring something, beyond the 21st century and to relate it in that time. And basically, it's really just looking at bringing things down to the very simple, but at the same time, not compromising the sophisticated nature of what Shabbat can speak to. So it's got an introduction, a conclusion, and 7 thoughts. Each one relates to different elements of our life that we can bring Shabbat into. It's very short. It's 60 pages, and I created an educator's guide for it. And fortunately, we actually sold it out very quickly. We sold out the first 5,000 copies. And I'm actually working on another book that Rabbi Sacks wrote the foreword for just before he passed away. I believe it was the last foreword he wrote. And I'm going to be putting that book into this. So I'm going to be collapsing the Shabbat into it, along with a section on the Chagim, on the festivals, a section on life cycle events, and a section on the Parsha. Because I want to have, basically a Torah thought on every main Jewish experience that we go through between all these different areas. And I think Shabbat belongs in there. The second book, which I came out with more recently, is by Palgrave Macmillan. It's a very academic book. It's, I believe, a very important book. And it really talks about conversion and Jewish identity. We have a terrible, terrible issue going on in the state of Israel today, with over 400,000 people that are not halachic Jews, which means they're not Jews from a Jewish law perspective, but they are from a law of return perspective. And that means that there's assimilation going on, sometimes, completely without people even knowing about it, within Israel. And so what I attempt to do is to really, I understand what Judaism is. It's not a religion. It's not a nation. It's not just a people. It's not just a country. It's not any of the typical frames that we use in philosophical terms, and try to understand what it is. And I borrow Rabbi Soloveitchik's terms of covenant of fate and covenant of destiny. And I try extend it. He alludes to in a seminal work he wrote called Kol Dodi Dofek, the voice of my beloved is calling, is knocking. He wrote a seminal work. He gave an incredible speech about it. And he talks about conversion almost in a footnote, almost as an aside. And I try and develop that in a very serious way and look at how conversion, whether it's the different rituals, whether it's the different components, mirror these different covenants and what it means to truly be Jewish, what it says about our Jewish identity. Because if conversion is the only way to become Jewish, according to the rabbis, other than being born a Jew, then it must say a lot about what Jewish identity is, because that's the only way to come into it. And then I actually fast forward towards the issues of Europe and how different thinkers actually applied different views of these covenants in their halachic decisions, in their Jewish law decisions relating to conversion. And finally, the last 2 chapters look at what's happened historically since the founding of the state in 1948 and some of the key issues of today and how we can build a paradigm towards greater solutions. So that's really, and that's called, that's a book by, as I said, by Palgrave Macmillan, and it's called Covenant and the Jewish Conversion Question, extending the thought of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik.
Wow, amazing. Very, very inspirational, I have to say. I want to ask you about your evolution as a Jew, right? And how Israel has played a part in that. Can you describe for us, the kind of Jew you are today and how you got there? Meaning, what sort of steps or processes or paradigm shifts you went through to become the Jew you are today? Like, what does that look like?
The kind of Jew I am today is a Jew that realizes that they're on a very strong journey. And I think that, the first question you asked was about my Jewish journey at the beginning of it. And I stopped when I was in grade 10. But that's really where a lot of my Jewish journey started. Even though when I was a child, I imbibed and I was imbued with incredible values and knowledge and understanding and skills, it really carried on through there. And I think the fundamental difference was really the journey from a passive Jew to an active Jew. I think that's the real journey that I've taken. When you're a child, everything is more passive. You're given food because you can't look after yourself. You're given shelter. You're given an education. Everything is spoon-fed for you. And I've basically been on this journey from that passive Jew that's receiving to an active Jew that's making conscious decisions about my Judaism in every single way, shape, and form. And that, whereas in the past, I could do certain things just because I did them, just because they're fun, right? Now I always look through a Jewish lens. And I say, great, this is fun, but is this what I need to be doing as a Jew? So for example, it could be really fun to go binge Netflix for the next 2 weeks, right? But when I put on my Jewish lens and I say to myself, is that really the best use of my time? Maybe there's time when I want to have healthy breaks, but to just go do that for that amount of time, I don't think is the best use of my time. What Judaism has forced me to think about is the fact that I have finite time in this world, the fact that I have a mission in this world, the fact that I have a purpose in this world, the fact that I have to live up to something, and I don't want to waste or squander that opportunity. And therefore, on a broad level, that's what it means. But on a practical level, in every single way, shape, and form, I think about which shoe I put on first. It sounds ludicrous, right? I stop before I eat something and say a blessing. It sounds ludicrous. I consider how much sleep I'm going to have. I consider what type of time I put into different areas, whether I'm further studying, whether I'm with my children. But these things make and break our lives at the end of the day. As something as plain and basic as the shoes, as the clothes I wear, if I put something on my head, if I, what I do on a Saturday, right? They sound very basic and monotonous, but I think that's the genius of Judaism, because it has the capacity to create the charisma of your life. It has the capacity to actually, in every single way, shape, and form, in every step that we take, to ensure that it is imbued with meaning. Now, even if I choose not to do that, but I understand that, I think it makes a greater difference. And that really takes me into my active Judaism. I came to Israel because I want to be sitting on the front rows of history. I don't want to be a spectator from some other place in the world. I don't for 1 second have any problem with anyone else that wants to. That's fine. We just had the Super Bowl recently. There's millions of people that watched it around the world, and there were only tens of people on the field. But I want to be one of those people on the field. I want to be one of those people that are writing the history of our future, not just reading about it in a textbook. And that's part of why I came here. I want my kids to have access to that. I want them to have opportunities I didn't have. I want them to be bilingual. I want them to be sitting and living in this unique time and period. In 100 years ago, we couldn't have dreamed about where we're living right now. And that extends to every area. So that's sort of what informs my active Jewish view. And it doesn't have to require any specific area. I think it's applicable to different people in different ways. But mine doesn't just, I don't just have my profession and my Judaism. I don't just have my family and my Judaism. I don't just have the world and my Judaism. My Judaism is completely enmeshed in all of those. It informs how I act in all of those. And it ultimately inspires and instigates that each of them can bring greater meaning towards my life. And hopefully through my life, I can bring meaning towards others.
Amazing. Talk to me a little bit about Shabbat, right? I mean, you wrote the book about it. You obviously observe it. There was a time in your life, a significant amount of time, that you didn't observe it like you do today. What kind of effect has the observance of Shabbat had on your life, and not just on Saturday, but throughout the entire week?
So in the Lechalodeh, we say, Kihi Makor HaBracha. It's the source of our blessing. And it makes no sense because it's a seventh of the time. But I really believe, in quality over quantity. And that one day, those 25 hours really informs my entire week. I think it just gives me a grounding, it gives me a perspective, it gives me an opportunity to spend that quality time with my children, to actually reflect strategically on my life. I find that most of my life I'm, going through all these different things and I do amazing stuff, but I never get to push that pause button like I do on Shabbat. If you're going to go into a movie cinema, people have been going to them less since COVID and the advent of so much online incredible stuff like Izzy. At the end of the day, when it comes to going into a movie cinema, what they try to do is dull any of the senses that we possibly can, which means we want to make it dark all around us, which means we want to make sure there's a comfortable chair so we're focused on the screen. We want the sound quality to be the best it possibly can, and we want the screen to be much bigger than it usually is. That's what Shabbat is for my life. It dulls all the other senses, it gets rid of all the other noise, and it makes me focus on what's important. And therefore, not just Shabbat is that meaningful, but it informs every day of my week. Because if you were to go in a lighthouse before you went on a ship on a journey, that planning stage where you design the map, where you choose where you're going to go, informs every single step on that journey. It's the same with life. This informs the journey that is life. And I think that Shabbat really provides that oasis in time, as per the name of my book, because it really is just this place where it's just this incredible thing, but in time. It's not a physical space. It goes with me wherever I am. It's this ultimate democratization. It's not just me. You could be billions of dollars wealthier than me, or billions, or not billions poorer, because I don't have billions, but a lot poorer than me. You can be much more educated than me or much less educated. You can be at any stage, but every single person encounters Shabbat if they choose to go into it in the same way. I was, when I grew up, I was very involved in Bondi Beach. And what I loved about Bondi Beach in Australia, other than the fact that it's a stunning, beautiful beach, is that anyone could come there. It's free to come in. And all different ages enjoyed the ocean and enjoyed the sand and enjoyed the sun, and enjoyed being around each other. For me, Shabbat is a deeper, more expansive, more nuanced version of that. It's just democratization of the capacity to plug into something that anyone can plug into just if they want to. And on that day, regardless of who you are during the week, we're all royalty. Everyone eats better. Everyone comes together with their family. Everyone dresses nicer. Everyone reads from the same text. Those that want to engage it in the same way. And to be part of that regal family, something that has just sustained us over years. As Achad Ha'am famously said, more than the fact that the Jews have kept Shabbat, it's Shabbat that has kept the Jews. And as an individual one of those, I personally feel it every single week.
Amazing. Very cool. So now let's talk about the future of Jewish, right? In light of the name of this podcast. You are a thinker, you are a visionary, you are somebody who spends a lot of time wondering how we can improve the Jewish state, the Jewish world, the Jewish lifestyle and culture and religion and so forth. What would you like to see happen in the Jewish world, let's say in the next 10 years?
First of all, I think that we need Shabbat moments as a broader Jewish people, right? There's a concept called Shemitah, which is in the 7th year, the farmers in the agrarian society let the land lay fallow. And I believe part of that wasn't just letting the land lay fallow. What did they do at that time? They ended up learning a lot more, and they ended up focusing and thinking on life. How often do we genuinely do that in the Jewish world? Take a step back and think strategically on a blank piece of paper. The Jewish people is one of the greatest startups in history, but we're never reevaluating ourselves. We're never reassessing ourselves. So I think one of the first things that needs to happen, and it needs to be genuine, and it needs to take out all the agendas, and people have attempted this in different ways, but the same ingredients keep preventing it. And there needs to be a strategic view. There needs to be an assessment on how can we truly, take this people to where it needs to go. And in order to answer that question, we need to ask, where does the people need to go? What do we want to do? And it's different strokes for different folks, it's different things with different people, but we need to take that step back to understand, to evaluate, to speak to people, and then to really think about what is that journey that we can do. And I think that strategic approach is critical. I think that, it needs to happen in a unified way. Unity without uniformity, right? But it needs to be unified. There needs to be everyone coming together, each person bringing the different resources that they have to bring to the table and learning from among the different places that we can really learn from. And I think that, there's not enough of that going on. I can tell you, when I was going from country to country, from city to city, speaking from community to community, there were so many places where people literally reinventing the wheel. Instead of investing another $200,000 to start this initiative, they could have got the textbook from that country, from that city, and literally just tweaked it for themselves, but they weren't sharing, they weren't communicating. Now, we live in a globalized society. Why can't we just get on a phone? Why can't we create shared services? There's corporations and there's organizations that are bigger than the entire people, right? There's ecosystems that are bigger than the Jewish people, and yet they still somehow manage to communicate across. If you look at all the people in a certain industry, right, they're able to communicate across, and we can't do it. It just makes no sense. So the first thing is a strategic approach. The second is doing it from a unified perspective and sharing and collaborating and working together. And the final thing is just challenging this apathy, both as a people and as individual people. We need to move, as I said in my journey, and I'm nowhere near there, but I'm working on it really hard, right, is to move from passive to active, is to be open to challenging different elements of our life, is to be open, not just to go through life, but to grow through life, to do it on a collective way, and even to do it as individuals, and to look at the tension between the two so we can do it successfully.
If I gave you $1 billion, US, Australian, whatever, how would you spend it in the Jewish world?
First of all, it makes a difference because the exchange rate, America's up at the moment. But basically, I think the greatest asset of the Jewish people is the Jewish people. And I think that we don't invest in that enough. We don't invest in big ideas. We don't invest in people that have that capacity. And I would go further. We also don't invest in little ideas and people that can do different parts. And part of that strategic planning in the previous part, I would want to do to inform where that $1 billion goes. We need a lot more than $1 billion, but basically to invest in our people. I see so many phenomenal individuals that, by virtue of the fact that either to be someone involved in the Jewish world is less cool or less attractive or gets less of a salary or whatever it is, do not do that. And they end up, some of them have the most beautiful, meaningful lives. And some of them, I speak to them when they're in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they just always reliving those moments when they were counselors or madrichim in their youth movement, and when they were volunteers, and when they were doing what they believed was meaningful. And I just feel so bad because they could be giving in the same space, but we don't allow that ecosystem and we don't help support them to be able to do that, because they can sell a product like Coca-Cola and get so much more money and so much more fanfare around it, rather than sell a product like Judaism. We have the greatest product. We are the worst salespeople. And at the end of the day, the only way we're going to get better salespeople is if we invest in that. And that is two ways. Number one, the broader strategy I said, and then it splits up into two ways. We need to find the super engagers, the super talented people. And I promise you, every single talent we need, whether they're a computer programmer, whether they're a social worker, whether they're a lawyer, whether they're an accountant, whether they're a doctor, whatever the skill sets, whatever the knowledge they have, and we need to imbue it in Jewish literacy, because they need to understand how to apply that in this world, and we need to give them that gift in a beautiful way. And then the people that are more knowledgeable, that have phenomenal Jewish literacy, we need to improve their engagement. We need to improve their capacity to be able to communicate it effectively to people that are not as interested in hearing it, not because they're not interested in hearing it inherently, but because it's coming across in a language that they just can't understand. And not just because people aren't saying it in Australian, because people aren't saying it in a language that they want to listen to. And I think that that's what needs to happen. If we can invest in people, help their trajectory, help their ideas, help them be on the path that's going to make the biggest difference, that's going to change the entire Jewish world. And that applies in every single sense. You can't represent the Jewish people if you don't know what the Jewish people represent. And there's too many of us that don't know what the Jewish people represent, so can't represent it. And some of us that know what it represents, but don't know how to represent it. If we can get that balance right, I think, that first billion is going to inspire many billions more to be able to really transform the Jewish world and heal the broader fractured world around us.
I think you've talked about this in different points of this conversation, but I'll ask it anyway. What's one conversation that you would like to get more attention in the Jewish world, over the next, let's say, 3, 5, 10 years?
So I think I think you're right. I've given a few of them. Another one could be, I think I think it relates to what I said about a Judaism engaged in the world. I think often we see it as a dichotomy. We see it as a contradiction. There's the universal world and there's the particular Jewish people. The problem with that is that often we will tend towards, and when I say we, I'm putting myself here, like certain society I was brought up in. Obviously, there's different in different places, but the people like me that grew up in this way will always feel like I need to be more universal. Everyone's important. I need to care about everyone. I need to care about everything. I don't want to be different. I don't want to have to, say to my employees at 6 p.m. on a Friday night, I have to go to a family dinner. I have to go to synagogue. I don't want to have to, no one else is giving 10% of their money to charity or why do I have to do that? Or why can't I just marry the person that I love? I meet them. They're attractive. Why can't I just marry them? Why can't I just bring up my kids in any country? Why can't they learn every language? Why do they need to learn a particular one? So that's the universal element. And I really understand that. And I have that pulling on me in many senses. But I think that if you stick to that, you lose the uniqueness of Judaism. And I think the beauty of Judaism is that our particular brand benefits the universal. Not only that, we can do more for the universe if we can understand who we truly are. And therefore, I think that's a conversation that needs to happen in an incredible way. And I think it needs to happen a lot more. And I think we need greater thinkers with greater nuance that know how to communicate, to explain the fact that both work well together. At the end of the day, no one is going to, punish you if you decide to spend more time with your partner or with your family than another random person, because you have a different relationship and responsibility to that person. But it doesn't mean you should ignore other people. And the way you have that relationship should improve your relationship with other people because of who the person you become through it is. It's the same with Judaism. The more we invest in that element of ourselves, especially at the formative stages of development, especially in the beginning decades of our life, then the more confident we are to go to the broader world, the more we have something to give, the more what we have to give is unique. And therefore, I think that we need to realize what's on our back door. We don't need to go, we can enjoy India and we can enjoy South America and all these different places, but first get to know Israel a little bit before you go out to that. You can enjoy different cultures, but get to know Judaism as well. You can enjoy different texts, but pick up the bestseller. It's called the Torah. There's so much there that has so much to do. And I understand that it's not always just accessible to everyone, but we need people that can make it more accessible to those that it is. And those that it isn't, we need to give them the avenues to be able to get there. And I think that what we'll find as a result is that if we're all universal, right? If we all do the John Lennon song, Imagine, which is a beautiful song, the downside is we'll all speak the same language, but we're going to have nothing to say. If we can be particular, then we'll have something unique to contribute to the conversation of humanity. And that's, I think, the balance, and that's a conversation I'd like to encourage.
I'm curious to know, you're definitely one of, in my opinion, the top thinkers in the Jewish world today. Who else, in terms of leaders, thinkers, doers, do you feel should be getting more attention in the Jewish world?
It's a really good question. There's a lot of people. Part of the luxury that I have is I get to really mix with so many different types of people. But if I'm going to be completely honest, I think it's people like my dad. At the end of the day, my father is a realistic role model for your average Jewish person out there. He's not a professor. He's not a rabbi, right? He's a successful business person, a phenomenal father, a great husband, an incredible friend, and an active Jew. And therefore, I think those are the types of people that really need more attention, because sometimes we put certain people on pedestals, and we should, and they should always be arranged. But I think that we need to expose some of these phenomenal people who are much more attainable for an average person, much more relatable for an average person. And I think that would inspire them. And if those people are active Jews and those people actually stop on Shabbat, but they also had to stop during a really important board meeting because they understand the world out there, and they actually invest the time with their family, and they decide, am I going to give an extra X to charity, or am I going to go on a better holiday? And they make that sacrifice because it's a value to them, and they choose values over valuables. Well, that's a meaningful contribution that I think should be shared with broader people. And I think the more practical examples we can give of people that are seen as more everyday, seen as more ordinary, but are truly extraordinary, that will inspire more ordinary people to be more extraordinary.
I love it. I love it. Your dad is actually quite a remarkable person, I have to say. So that's a great answer. My last question for you, Benji, is if there's one action item, one piece of advice that people can take from this conversation and say, that's something that I can implement in my life, whether it's on a day-to-day basis, week to week, what's the one thing you want people to take from this conversation?
Don't just go through life, grow through life. Bring meaning into your life. Do everything you have with intention. Don't just find yourself in a place. Make sure that you decided to come into that place, and ensure that you're an active Jew and not just a passive Jew, that you're an active human being and not just a passive human being, that you're an active father or mother, you're an active friend, you're an active sibling, you're an active child, you're an active, whatever it is in your life, an active employee, an active employer. Make sure that you're thinking through every step. I think that's one of the big challenges that Judaism brings to us. I think it's one of the great questions that Judaism asks of us. And the greatest answer that we can give is the way we live our life.
Benji, it's been really an incredible conversation. Thank you for joining me, and let's talk soon.
Thank you so much. And I give you a blessing that you're able to spark more conversations, and that ultimately these conversations lead to true action, because that's what sustained our people over time. And that's what will continue to sustain our people, taking action, making a difference, and truly making it count.
Man, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.